complicated subject. That's why we haven't fixed it yet. Any answer has to balance our need for safety with the respect for the civil rights of individuals and an acknowledgement that this is a constitutional republic. It's not the set of Morning Joe. For example, pretty much everybody agrees that people with mental illness should not have firearms. That sounds simple, okay. But what do you do then with the more than 400,000 Iraq and Afghanistan vets who have received a diagnosis of PTSD? That's a mental disorder. Should they lose their rights to gun ownership because they were injured by war? All of a sudden, it's not so simple. Or how about domestic abusers? Nobody thinks they should have guns. We don't, obviously. But what if they haven't been convicted of anything yet? Can you strip rights from somebody who is legally innocent? And if you can take their gun rights away, how about their voting rights or their free speech rights? We're not sure of the answers to those, but we're positive they are real questions that need to be debated and considered by smart people sincerely trying to make the country better. The media screechers are not helping. They're telling us it's a simple fix as long as you care enough. That's a lie, and they're using children to tell that lie. Spare us. We're for the children. We're not for you. Congressman Jim Hines is a Democrat who represents Connecticut. He joins us tonight. And Congressman, unlike a lot of people, you've been specific about what you want, and I admire that. You were on CNN on Monday, and you said, and I'm quoting now, we want to be no different from Canada or Australia or Great Britain. So in Australia, and you hear this a lot from the left, 650,000 guns were confiscated from citizens, and that's what you're calling for. Who would do that? Who would take those guns in this country?
No, that's not what I'm calling for, Tucker. Australia is a pretty good example because after the massacre of 35 of its citizens in Port Arthur in 1996, they implemented a whole series. And I don't usually agree with you, Tucker, but you're right. This is a complicated problem that won't get solved, certainly not by the media on either side, but it will get solved over time, not perfectly, by lots of measures, some of which were tried by Australia. Now, Australia doesn't have a Second Amendment, so they're not the best example, but we do know that if we could get universal background check, no matter where you buy a gun, you get a background check. We do know that if you could find a way, and I admit that it is complicated with rights to make sure that people with temporary restraining orders temporarily give up their weapons. If you could do a whole bunch of those things, there is no question that, like Australia, we could see our gun violence in this country plummet.
Well, there is a question about that. I mean, we don't actually know. And we had the assault weapons ban of 1994, and it seemed like it would reduce killings, and it didn't. We know that conclusively. So you're never quite sure what the effect is, but you twice pointed to Australia as a model for gun policy here. So what specifically about Australia? Again, a country that confiscated its citizens' guns by the hundreds of thousands. What specifically did they do that we should do?
Yeah, you can keep using the word confiscation.
Well, they did. That's a fact. No, that's a fact.
I was calling for. It is also a fact that they instituted a mandatory waiting period for the purchase of a gun. It is also a fact that they instituted a universal background check. Two things that we don't have in this country that might be considered constitutional. So you can leave the confiscation behind because that's not what anybody is talking about.
But that was the essence. That was the essence of what they did. You're not allowed to own a gun in Australia except under circumstances where the government says you've somehow got a right to. Same with Great Britain. You pointed to Great Britain. In Great Britain, you're not allowed to own a gun. You have to prove that you should be allowed to have one. Are you calling for that?
Well, no, I'm not. In both of those countries, in the absence of a Second Amendment, you're right. You have to show a cause, a reason to have a gun. We have a Second Amendment in this country, which you may be surprised to hear I support. So we're obviously not going to require the citizens. Well, you can say that as much as you want, Tucker, but it's not
I'm just saying it once in response to what you said.
What I'm calling for is what, by the way, the president, I'm not usually in the habit of praising the president, what the president has said he's willing to consider. Things like tightening up the background check, things like restrictions on technology like bump stocks. Nobody's calling for confiscation or for everything they do in Australia and Great Britain.
Just to be clear, don't paint me as a demagogue. You just said this 2 days ago on CNN, and you pointed specifically to a country that got rid of gun violence because it got rid of guns. So I think it's a fair question for me to ask when you point to Australia, why are you not calling for confiscation? Because that's the core thing they did.
First of all, Australia did not get rid of guns. There are still a lot of guns in Australia. There are plenty of guns in Canada. There are plenty of guns in the United Kingdom. These are countries that are different than our own. But no, they did not get rid of guns in any one of those countries. So
but they
can keep talking about Australia. I never called for confiscation.
You're the one who was talking about Australia, not me. Okay, so let me just say this: those countries also have universal. have universal gun registration.
Australia is a good model in one way. Australia is a good model in one way, which was that after a tragedy, 35 people dead in Port Arthur, they got together, the Prime Minister and 6 states got together and said, let's pass a package of gun safety changes that will reduce violence. Now, not all of those changes would apply in the United States. I'm not calling for that.
Like taking them away by force from the population. So let me ask you this. Those countries also have
you can keep
universal,
saying that, but that's not what anybody is calling for.
I'm sorry. I know a lot about this, and that was the whole point of the bill. So, and you must know that too.
That was a part of the bill that I'm not calling for, and frankly, almost nobody is calling for confiscation.
Okay, so let me ask you this: those countries all have universal gun registration? You own a gun, you have to register it with the government. Are you for that?
They actually canceled the universal gun registration in Australia because they felt that it was more of a burden on legal gun owners than it was on people who were going to use guns illegally. No, I'm not necessarily for it in the United States. I am for everybody having a background check. I am for people with temporary restraining orders temporarily giving up their guns. I am for a limit on the size of the magazine that you can use. Things that we've done here in the state of Connecticut, which have been constitutional and have not resulted in people's Second Amendment rights being violated in Connecticut.
I was wondering this today. So you work up on Capitol Hill surrounded by armed guards. Do you think they have too many guns, and do you believe that their magazines hold too many rounds? And if not, why not?
Tucker, nice try. You're not going to get me to say that
they protect you.
Officers...
You feel safe with a lot of people with high-capacity magazines, but I'm not allowed to have them in my house to protect my family? Because why? Explain it slowly so I can understand.
Okay, all right, let's explain that. That's an absurd argument, but let me agree with you that I would be perfectly happy with the general public having the same firearms that the Capitol Police have if the general public were, like Capitol Police, required to undergo a criminal check, required to recertify themselves every single year for the use of those firearms, and personally accountable and professionally accountable for how they're used. So if you're willing to put all of those restrictions on the general public's right to own firearms, which is what the Capitol Police have, which is what
no
Marines
right
have,
otherwise. Let me just ask you finally one last question. So you just, because some of us are confused by the details here, you endorsed the most recent iteration of the assault weapons ban. And in that, and I've asked this question of a lot of lawmakers, I'll be interested to see your response. In that, it would ban rifles that have something called a barrel shroud. Those would be illegal. Yeah. What is a barrel shroud, and why would you ban it?
So a barrel shroud, as you probably know, because you've talked to your other guests about it, is a covering on the barrel of a gun that allows you to hold that gun when the barrel has overheated because of multiple rounds being fired.
That's correct. That's right.
Right. Okay, so we agree on that. Now, I'm not all that worked up over barrel shrouds, and I'm not even interested really in going the route of saying that an assault weapon ban will solve our problems. I happen to support a ban on technology that allows you to squeeze off 20 or 30 rounds in a minute or two. Now, I understand that the definition of an assault weapon is tough.
But then why did you support the bill that would have banned that and pistol grips and folding stocks and bayonet lugs and all these things that are irrelevant? It makes you seem not serious if you support something like that.
You know, lots of states have passed assault weapons ban. I heard you talking about, the desire of the populace earlier. Lots of states have implemented, including my own of Connecticut, assault weapon ban. Now, what I'm going to tell you is that the number of people who die in this country as a result of assault weapons, though they make the headlines, that is a relatively small percentage. Nonetheless, I don't want people to have guns that allow them, and most police officers don't want people to have guns that allow them to squeeze off 20 or 30 rounds very rapidly without reloading. Look, you asked about barrel shrouds. I'm not sure that barrel shrouds are the key here.
I think I'll let you unpack it all, and I appreciate your willingness to come on and explain your views on this. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tucker.
Rachel Campos-Duffy is a Fox News contributor, and she joins us tonight. Rachel, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
So you talked to these politicians about what just happened last week in Parkland, and the story is at least in part about the failures of the government, of the FBI, of local police, but really the federal authorities to respond to a lot of warning signs, consistent warning signs. Should we be surprised that government officials just ignore that, and that the solution is always taking rights away from people who didn't do anything wrong and never holding to account the people who did, which is the FBI in this case? Why do they never mention that?
Well, it's a great point, but I'd also say this to you. I mean, I come at this from a very two very personal points of view. One is I'm a military brat who was raised overseas, and the buses that I was on had armed security. The schools I went to were fortified, and I felt very safe. So when I hear that part of the conversation, that we should be fortifying our schools, that's something the federal government could do. State governments could do that as well. And I'm 100% for that. I'm also the wife of a congressman. As you know, this year we had a Bernie Sanders volunteer who shot up a bunch of Republican congressmen on a baseball field. And the only reason we didn't have a mass execution of those congressmen on that field is because Steve Scalise happened to be part of that baseball team. And by the way, he was going to leave 5 minutes after the shooter came. Had he left, there would not have been, he has a detail of Capitol policemen. He's the only one, he and leadership. So had he not been there, we would have had a massacre on that baseball field. So you brought up an excellent point in that, in your discussion with the congressman from Connecticut, which is that Nancy Pelosi and many politicians have security. Why aren't we securing our schools, and why aren't people allowed to take responsibility for their own security?
Because in the end, you know, if there's a real disaster, and I've seen it firsthand a couple of times, the cops leave. They've got families too. They're not going to protect you. I've seen it. You got to protect yourself or you're not going to be protected. So why are we allowing blowhards from the Congress to try and strip our ability to protect ourselves? I don't understand.
Well, we shouldn't. And as citizens, what we should do is expand the conversation. It's very dynamic. It's very complicated. It's about fortifying our schools. But listen, when Adam Lanza's mom, before he killed her, after he shot up the children in Newtown, she wanted to have him committed. And after that massacre in Newtown, many parents came forward and said, I'm scared of my mentally ill child who has had violent tendencies, and they can't get those children committed. So there's a problem there. Sure. And frankly, there's another problem, Tucker, that people don't want to talk about, and that is that we have a family crisis in this country. There are broken homes, broken families. There's a moral crisis, and we have families in schools that really, frankly, a culture that's unwilling to talk about right from wrong.
No, you're right.
That's also a part of the problem that Hollywood and the left is unwilling to talk about.
Yeah, it turns out the nuclear family works pretty well. We should have thought about that before we destroyed it. Rachel, thank you very much.
Good point.
Great to see you.